The Boltzmann Brain Paradox. The Boltzmann Brain Paradox is a thought experiment rooted in statistical mechanics and cosmology, posing a profound challenge to our understanding of reality, entropy, and the nature of observation. The paradox arises from the implications of Ludwig Boltzmann's statistical interpretation of thermodynamics, combined with modern cosmological theories about the universe's structure and evolution. At its core, the paradox questions whether the universe, as we perceive it, is statistically more likely to be a random fluctuation in a vast, chaotic cosmos rather than a stable, ordered system. Origins in statistical mechanics. Ludwig Boltzmann, a 19th-century physicist, made foundational contributions to statistical mechanics by explaining entropy as a measure of disorder within a system. His work showed that entropy tends to increase over time, leading to the second law of thermodynamics. However, Boltzmann also recognized that, given enough time, random fluctuations could cause entropy to decrease locally, creating pockets of order in an otherwise disordered universe. This idea leads to an unsettling possibility. If the universe persists long enough in a high-entropy state, it becomes statistically probable that self-aware structures, like human brains, could spontaneously form from random fluctuations. These hypothetical entities, dubbed Boltzmann brains, would arise fully formed with false memories and perceptions of a coherent reality, despite having no actual past or external world. The cosmological context. Modern cosmology complicates this picture. Observations suggest that the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate, driven by dark energy. If this continues indefinitely, the cosmos will approach a state of maximum entropy known as heat death, where matter and energy are uniformly distributed. In such a scenario, the universe would be a near-equilibrium system, making random fluctuations the dominant source of any ordered structures. Given enough time, the probability of a Boltzmann brain appearing would surpass that of an ordered, evolving universe like ours. This leads to the paradox. If Boltzmann brains are more likely than real observers in a low-entropy universe, why do we appear to exist in a stable, structured cosmos rather than as fleeting fluctuations? Philosophical implications. The Boltzmann brain paradox forces us to confront deep questions about consciousness, reality, and the nature of scientific observation. If our perceptions are more likely to be the product of a random fluctuation than of a continuous universe, how can we trust any empirical knowledge? Science relies on the assumption that observations reflect an objective, consistent reality. If Boltzmann brains are statistically favored, this foundation is undermined. One response is to reject the idea that Boltzmann brains are more probable by refining our cosmological models. Some theories suggest that the universe's initial conditions were finely tuned to avoid such fluctuations, making our existence as evolved observers more plausible. Others propose that the multiverse theory, where countless universes with different physical constants exist, could explain why we find ourselves in a stable, low-entropy universe rather than as Boltzmann brains. Criticisms and counterarguments. Critics argue that the Boltzmann brains scenario relies on assumptions about the universe's lifespan and the nature of quantum fluctuations that may not hold. For instance, if the universe's expansion prevents fluctuations from ever reaching the complexity required to form a self-aware entity, Boltzmann brains would remain impossible. Additionally, some physicists suggest that the very concept of a Boltzmann brain is incoherent, as a fully formed brain with false memories may not qualify as a valid observer in any meaningful sense. Another objection is that the paradox may be a reductio ad absurdum of certain cosmological models, rather than a genuine physical possibility. If a theory predicts that Boltzmann brains should dominate reality, but we clearly do not observe this, the theory itself may need revision. Possible resolutions. Several approaches have been proposed to resolve the paradox. One is the anthropic principle, which states that observations about the universe must be compatible with the conscious life that observe it. In this view, we find ourselves in a stable universe, simply because such conditions are necessary for us to exist at all. Another resolution comes from quantum mechanics. If consciousness is tied to quantum processes that cannot emerge from random fluctuations, Boltzmann brains may be inherently unstable or impossible. Alternatively, some models of eternal inflation, where new universes continually form, suggest that the vast majority of observers would arise in young, structured universes rather than as isolated fluctuations in an old, decaying cosmos. The role of entropy. The paradox also highlights the strange role of entropy in cosmology. The early universe was in an extremely low entropy state, which is highly improbable from a statistical standpoint. This fine-tuning is what allows complex structures like galaxies, stars, and life to form. The Boltzmann Brains scenario inverts this. If entropy dominates over time, why did we start in such an ordered state rather than a chaotic one? Some theories, like Roger Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology, attempt to explain the low-entropy initial conditions without invoking Boltzmann-like fluctuations. Others suggest that the arrow of time itself may be an emergent property, making the paradox a misunderstanding of how entropy operates on cosmological scales. Conclusion. The Boltzmann brain paradox remains an unresolved challenge at the intersection of physics, cosmology, and philosophy. It forces us to question the nature of reality, the validity of our observations, and the assumptions underlying our cosmological models. While various theories attempt to resolve the paradox, none have yet provided a definitive answer. Whether the solution lies in refining our understanding of entropy, revising cosmological theories, or redefining what constitutes an observer, the paradox serves as a humbling reminder of how much we still do not know about the universe and our place within it. Ultimately, the Boltzmann brain paradox is not just a theoretical curiosity, but a profound inquiry into the foundations of science itself. It pushes us to consider whether our perceived reality is a stable, ordered system or a fleeting anomaly in an infinite sea of chaos, a question that may remain unanswered until we develop a deeper understanding of the cosmos. The solipsism nightmare. Solipsism is the philosophical idea that only one's mind is certain to exist, casting doubt on the reality of anything outside subjective experience. At its extreme, solipsism suggests that the external world, including other people, physical objects, and even the laws of nature, might be mere constructs of one's own consciousness. This radical skepticism leads to what some call the solipsism nightmare, the unsettling realization that, if solipsism were true, one could never truly confirm the existence of anything beyond their own thoughts. The foundations of solipsism. Solipsism emerges from deep epistemological skepticism, the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature and limits of knowledge. The core question is, how can we be certain that anything exists outside our own perceptions? René Descartes famously grappled with this in his Meditations on First Philosophy, where he doubted everything except his own thinking. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. While Descartes used this skepticism to rebuild knowledge on firmer grounds, solipsism takes doubt further, refusing to grant certainty even to the external world. The problem arises because all knowledge of the outside world is mediated through perception. If our senses can be deceived, as in dreams or hallucinations, and if even logic and memory could be unreliable, then the only indubitable fact is the existence of the self as a thinking entity. This radical position is difficult to disprove because any evidence against solipsism, such as interactions with others or scientific observations, would still be filtered through the solipsist's own mind. The nightmare scenario. The nightmare aspect of solipsism lies in its implications. If solipsism were true, then other minds may not exist. Every person one interacts with could be a figment of imagination, lacking true consciousness. Relationships, emotions, and social bonds would be illusions, rendering life existentially hollow. Reality is unverifiable, science, history, and shared knowledge would have no objective basis. The laws of physics might simply be projections of the solipsist's mind rather than fundamental truths. Isolation is absolute. The solipsist would be utterly alone, trapped in a self-generated reality with no way to escape or confirm an external world. This scenario is unsettling because it undermines trust in perception, memory, and reasoning, the very tools we use to navigate existence. Unlike philosophical thought experiments that remain abstract, solipsism threatens to collapse the foundations of meaning, knowledge, and interpersonal connection. Philosophical responses to solipsism. While solipsism is logically difficult to refute, many philosophers have attempted to address its challenges. Pragmatic rejection. Some argue that even if solipsism cannot be disproven, it is pragmatically useless. If reality behaves consistently, whether it is external or imaginary, one may as well act as if the external world is real. William James and later pragmatists suggested that beliefs should be judged by their practical consequences rather than absolute certainty. Intersubjective verification. Another counterargument is that the consistency of shared human experience suggests an objective reality. If multiple independent observers report the same phenomena, e.g., scientific experiments, the likelihood of a purely subjective reality diminishes. Neuroscientific evidence. Studies in neuroscience show that perception is constructed by the brain, but this construction relies on external stimuli. Brain damage, sensory deprivation, and hallucinations demonstrate that consciousness depends on interaction with an external world, even if that world is mediated by the senses. Evolutionary argument. From a biological standpoint, a brain that evolved purely to deceive itself would be maladaptive. Perception and cognition likely developed because they provided survival advantages in a real environment. Despite these arguments, solipsism retains its power because it exploits the gap between perception and reality, a gap that can never be fully closed with absolute certainty. Solipsism in cognitive science and artificial intelligence. Modern cognitive science and AI research have inadvertently revived solipsistic concerns. If consciousness arises from information processing, how do we know that other beings or even advanced AI are truly conscious rather than just simulating it? The philosophical zombie thought experiment, a hypothetical entity that behaves like a conscious being but lacks inner experience, echoes solipsism's core problem. Similarly, in virtual reality and simulation theory, the question arises, if a mind can be perfectly simulated, how can it ever know whether its reality is base or constructed? Some argue that solipsism becomes more plausible in a world where artificial minds and digital environments blur the line between real and simulated experience. Psychological and emotional impact. While solipsism is primarily a metaphysical issue, its psychological effects can be profound. Persistent engagement with solipsistic doubt can lead to existential anxiety, the fear that one is truly alone in the universe, with all meaning being self-generated and thus potentially meaningless. Depersonalization and derealization, a sense of detachment from reality, where the world feels unreal or dreamlike. Social alienation. If others are doubted to be truly conscious, forming deep emotional connections becomes difficult, leading to isolation. However, most people do not experience solipsism as a lived reality. The brain's natural tendency toward pattern recognition, social bonding, and belief in a stable world acts as a psychological buffer against such extreme skepticism. Solipsism versus skepticism versus idealism. Solipsism is often conflated with related but distinct philosophies. Skepticism questions the certainty of knowledge, but does not necessarily deny external reality. Idealism, e.g., Berkeley's immaterialism, argues that reality is fundamentally mental, but does not reduce it to a single mind. Solipsism is the most extreme, denying all existence outside the self. Unlike idealism, which allows for a shared mental reality, e.g., a universe sustained by a universal mind, solipsism leaves the individual completely isolated. Is there any way out? Since solipsism cannot be logically disproven, the only escape is either to accept it as an unfalsifiable but ultimately paralyzing idea or to adopt a stance of mitigated skepticism, acknowledging that while absolute certainty is impossible, the external world's consistency makes belief in it reasonable. Some philosophers, like Ludwig Wittgenstein, argue that language and shared experience make solipsism incoherent. If nothing exists beyond the self, then concepts like truth, reality, and others lose meaning. Thus, solipsism may be a self-defeating position, as even expressing it requires assuming a framework beyond pure subjectivity. Solipsism, the loneliest philosophy. Solipsism is one of the most isolating and intellectually challenging philosophies ever conceived. At its core, it posits that the only thing one can truly know to exist is one's own mind. Everything else, other people, the external world, even the laws of physics, could be mere illusions, figments of one's own consciousness. This radical skepticism makes solipsism a deeply lonely philosophy, as it casts doubt on the very existence of anything beyond the self. While few people genuinely adhere to solipsism as a practical worldview, its implications force us to confront fundamental questions about reality, perception, and the limits of human knowledge. The foundations of solipsism. Solipsism emerges from the broader tradition of skepticism, which questions the certainty of knowledge. The term itself derives from the Latin solus, alone, and ipsi self, literally translating to the self alone. Unlike other philosophical doctrines that seek to establish truths about the world, solipsism takes an extreme position. The only undeniable truth is that I exist, and everything else is uncertain. This idea finds its roots in René Descartes' famous declaration, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes used radical doubt to strip away all assumptions, concluding that even if an evil demon were deceiving him about everything, the fact that he was thinking proved his own existence. However, while Descartes used this as a starting point to rebuild knowledge, solipsism stops here, refusing to grant certainty to anything beyond the self. The solipsistic dilemma. The primary challenge of solipsism is its unfalsifiability. It cannot be disproven. If one claims that only their mind exists, there is no external evidence that can definitively refute it. Any argument against solipsism must rely on premises that the solipsist could dismiss as part of their own mental construct. This makes solipsism both frustrating and fascinating. It is a philosophical position that resists all attempts at external validation. This leads to what might be called the loneliness of solipsism. If one truly believes that other minds do not exist, then all relationships, conversations, and emotional bonds are mere projections of one's own consciousness. Love, hatred, friendship, and conflict are reduced to internal phenomena, stripping them of their shared meaning. The solipsist is trapped in an inescapable solitude, where even the attempt to communicate this idea to others becomes paradoxical. If others are not real, then why speak at all? Variations of solipsism. While pure solipsism is rare, some modified versions explore its implications without fully embracing its isolation. Epistemological solipsism. This form does not claim that the external world does not exist, only that one cannot be certain of it. It is a stance on the limits of knowledge rather than an assertion of reality. Methodological solipsism. Used in cognitive science and philosophy of mind, this approach temporarily assumes that only the self exists as a tool for analyzing consciousness, without making metaphysical claims. Metaphysical solipsism, the most extreme form, asserting that only the self exists and everything else is a creation of one's mind. Each of these variations grapples with the same core issue, the impossibility of proving the existence of anything outside subjective experience. Psychological and emotional implications. Few people truly live as solipsists. Human beings are inherently social, and our brains are wired to perceive others as real, independent agents. However, the feeling of solipsism can emerge in moments of extreme isolation or existential crisis. People suffering from severe depression or dissociation sometimes report sensations akin to solipsism, feeling utterly detached from reality, as though the world is an illusion. This raises an important question. If solipsism is psychologically unbearable, does that make it false? Some argue that the very discomfort it produces suggests that human cognition is structured to reject it. Our minds seem to demand external validation, shared experiences, and social bonds, things that solipsism denies. Solipsism in literature and art. The haunting nature of solipsism has made it a recurring theme in literature and art. Many works explore the terror of being trapped in one's own mind. Borges' The Circular Ruins tells of a man who dreams another person into existence, only to realize he himself may be someone else's dream. Philip K. Dick's Ubik plays with the instability of reality, leaving the reader unsure of what is real and what is a mental construct. The film The Truman Show presents a man whose entire life is a fabricated reality, echoing solipsistic fears of being alone in a manufactured world. These narratives resonate because they tap into a primal fear that our experiences might be illusions, that we might be utterly alone. Philosophical counterarguments. Despite its stubborn resistance to refutation, many philosophers have attempted to dismantle solipsism. The argument from practical necessity. Even if solipsism is logically possible, it is pragmatically useless. If one behaves as though the external world is real, the distinction between reality and illusion becomes meaningless. The problem of language. Language is inherently communicative. If other minds do not exist, why would a solipsist develop a system meant for interaction? Neuroscientific evidence. Brain studies show that perception is dependent on external stimuli, suggesting that the mind does not generate reality in isolation. However, none of these arguments disprove solipsism. They merely make it an impractical and emotionally unsatisfying position. Is there any value in solipsism? If solipsism is so extreme and isolating, why does it persist in philosophical discourse? Its value lies in its ability to expose the fragility of human knowledge. By pushing skepticism to its limits, solipsism forces us to question how much we truly know and what we take for granted. It also serves as a reminder of the importance of intersubjectivity, the shared experiences that form the basis of human connection. Even if we cannot prove that others exist, our mutual interactions create a functional reality that solipsism cannot replicate. Conclusion. The ultimate isolation. Solipsism remains the loneliest philosophy because it denies the very thing that makes life meaningful: connection. To live as a solipsist is to inhabit a world where every smile, every conversation, every act of love is just a shadow in one's own mind. While it is a powerful thought experiment, its emotional barrenness ensures that few embrace it fully. Yet in its extreme doubt, solipsism offers a strange kind of clarity, the understanding that reality, as we know it, is built on trust that others exist, that our senses do not deceive us, and that the world outside our minds is real. And perhaps that trust, however unprovable, is what keeps us from the abyss of absolute solitude. The illusion of the self. The concept of the self is one of the most deeply ingrained assumptions in human experience. From the moment we become aware of our existence, we operate under the belief that there is a stable, continuous I at the center of our thoughts, emotions, and actions. This sense of self feels undeniable. It is the lens through which we perceive the world, the voice in our heads, the entity that makes decisions and claims ownership over experiences. Yet upon closer examination, the self begins to appear far less solid than it seems. Neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy have all questioned the notion of a fixed, unchanging identity, suggesting instead that what we call the self may be an ever-shifting construct, a narrative woven together by the brain to create coherence out of chaos. The fragmented nature of identity. If we attempt to locate the self, we quickly run into contradictions. Is the self the body? The body is in a constant state of change. Cells regenerate, organs age, sensations fluctuate. The body we inhabit today is not the same as the body we had a decade ago, yet we still feel like the same person. Is the self the mind? Thoughts arise and pass without our control. Emotions surge and fade. Memories are reconstructed rather than perfectly preserved. There is no single, unchanging core to be found in mental processes. Even our personalities, which seem to define who we are, shift depending on context, environment, and time. The confident, outgoing version of oneself at a social gathering may give way to a hesitant, introspective version in solitude. Neuroscience reveals that the brain operates as a collection of interconnected modules, each handling different functions: perception, emotion, decision-making, memory, without a central command center. Studies on split-brain patients, whose corpus callosum has been severed, demonstrate that the brain can produce conflicting intentions and explanations, with each hemisphere acting independently. This challenges the idea of a unified self, suggesting instead that the feeling of unity is a post hoc construction. The brain stitches together perceptions, impulses, and memories to create the illusion of a singular, continuous identity. The narrative self. One of the key ways the illusion of the self is maintained is through storytelling. Humans are natural narrators. We construct cohesive life stories to make sense of our experiences. This narrative self is not an objective truth, but a selective interpretation. We emphasize certain events, downplay others, and revise memories to fit our current self-image. A failure in the past may be reinterpreted as a valuable lesson. A moment of luck may be framed as personal triumph. The narrative self is flexible, adapting to new information and shifting perspectives, yet it creates the impression of a stable, enduring identity. Psychological studies show that people often misremember their past beliefs and attitudes, aligning them with their present views. This phenomenon, known as memory distortion, demonstrates how the brain maintains the illusion of consistency even when our thoughts and feelings have changed. The narrative self is not a fixed entity, but an ongoing construction, edited and revised throughout life. The role of perception. Perception itself is a constructed experience, further complicating the notion of a stable self. The brain does not passively receive information from the senses, but actively interprets and predicts. Optical illusions, for example, reveal how perception can diverge from reality. What we see is not an objective reflection of the world, but the brain's best guess. Similarly, the sense of self is a perceptual construct. The feeling of being inside the body, of being the thinker of thoughts, is generated by neural processes rather than evidence of an independent self. Experiments in cognitive science have demonstrated how easily the sense of self can be manipulated. In the rubber hand illusion, participants come to perceive a fake hand as their own when their real hand is hidden, and both are stroked synchronously. This shows that body ownership is a malleable perception, not an absolute truth. Even more striking are out-of-body experiences induced in laboratory settings, where electrical stimulation of the brain can create the sensation of floating outside oneself. These findings suggest that the feeling of being a unified self is a fragile and contingent phenomenon. The self as a process, rather than a static entity. The self might be better understood as a dynamic process, an ever-changing flow of sensations, thoughts, and interactions. Buddhist philosophy, though not invoking religious doctrine here, has long emphasized this idea, proposing that what we call the self is a collection of transient aggregates. Modern psychology echoes this view, framing identity as a series of mental and physical events without an underlying essence. This perspective can be liberating. If the self is not a fixed, unchanging core, then rigid self-definitions, I am shy, I am uncreative, I am flawed, lose their solidity. Recognizing the self as a process allows for greater flexibility and growth. Behaviors and traits are not inherent, but emerge from circumstances, habits, and conditioning. This understanding aligns with therapeutic approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, which operates on the principle that self-perception can be reshaped through awareness and practice. The illusion of control. Another pillar of the self-illusion is the belief in conscious control. We like to think that our decisions are made by a rational, autonomous self, but research in psychology and neuroscience suggests otherwise. Studies on decision-making reveal that the brain often initiates actions before we are consciously aware of the choice. The feeling of deciding may be a retrospective explanation rather than the actual cause of behavior. This undermines the notion of a central decider within us. Instead, actions arise from a complex interplay of neural processes, environmental cues, and unconscious biases. The sense of agency, the belief that I am in control, is another constructed experience, one that helps maintain the illusion of a coherent self. Implications of the self-illusion. Recognizing the self as an illusion does not mean denying personal experience or advocating for passivity. Rather, it invites a shift in perspective. If the self is not an immutable entity, then many sources of suffering, rigid self-judgment, fear of change, attachment to identity, can be re-evaluated. The anxiety over who I really am may dissolve when identity is seen as fluid and context-dependent. This view also fosters empathy. If others, too, are not fixed entities but ever-changing processes, then labels and judgments become less absolute. Understanding the constructed nature of the self can reduce the rigidity of personal and social conflicts, allowing for more adaptive and compassionate interactions. Living without a fixed self. Embracing the self as an illusion does not lead to nihilism, but to a more flexible and engaged way of being. Without the weight of a fixed identity, experimentation and growth become natural. Mistakes are not failures of an essential self, but opportunities for learning. Relationships are not clashes of rigid identities, but dynamic interactions. Meditative and mindfulness practices often explore this insight by encouraging observation of thoughts and sensations without attachment. The paradox of free will. The idea that we possess free will, that we are the conscious authors of our choices and actions, is foundational to human identity. It underpins our sense of autonomy, moral responsibility, and personal agency. We praise or blame others based on the assumption that they could have acted differently. We agonize over decisions, believing that our deliberation leads to freely chosen outcomes. Yet, when scrutinized, the concept of free will unravels into a paradox. Neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy suggest that our sense of control may be an illusion, a narrative constructed after the fact rather than a true causal force. At the same time, abandoning the notion of free will altogether seems to undermine the very fabric of human motivation, ethics, and law. This tension between the feeling of freedom and the evidence that our choices are determined by prior causes lies at the heart of one of the most enduring debates in human thought, the illusion of conscious choice. One of the most striking challenges to free will comes from neuroscience. Experiments have demonstrated that brain activity precedes conscious decision-making by several seconds. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted a landmark study where participants were asked to press a button at a moment of their choosing while watching a clock. They were also to note the exact time they felt the intention to move. Libet found that brain signals, the readiness potential, appeared up to half a second before participants were consciously aware of their decision. This suggests that the brain initiates actions before the mind becomes aware of them, implying that what we experience as making a choice may be a retrospective justification rather than the true origin of the action. Later studies using functional MRI reinforced this finding, showing that brain activity could predict a person's decision up to 10 seconds before they were consciously aware of it. If our choices are initiated unconsciously, then the feeling of volition may be an illusion, a story the brain tells itself to make sense of actions that were already set in motion by neural processes beyond our awareness. Determinism and the causal chain. Free will becomes even more problematic when viewed through the lens of determinism, the idea that every event, including human decisions, is the inevitable result of prior causes. If the universe operates according to physical laws, then our brains, as physical systems, must also follow these laws. Every thought, emotion, and decision arises from a chain of preceding biological, environmental, and social factors: genetics, upbringing, past experiences, current brain chemistry, and external stimuli. From this perspective, the notion that we could have acted differently in any given moment is an illusion. Even our sense of deliberation, weighing pros and cons before choosing, is itself the product of prior causes. If we could rewind time and replay the exact same conditions, the same choice would presumably occur. This deterministic view leaves no room for libertarian free will, the idea that we are somehow exempt from the causal chain and can make truly independent choices. Compatibilism, reconciling freedom and determinism. Faced with the conflict between free will and determinism, some philosophers argue for compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. According to this perspective, free will does not require absolute, uncaused agency, but rather the ability to act according to one's desires and intentions without external coercion. For example, if you choose to drink coffee rather than tea in the morning, this decision is still free in a meaningful sense, even if it was shaped by your past preferences, habits, and brain chemistry. What matters is that the choice aligns with your internal motivations rather than being forced upon you. In this framework, free will is not about breaking the causal chain, but about acting in accordance with your own reasoning and desires. Critics, however, argue that compatibilism merely redefines free will to fit within determinism without truly resolving the paradox. If our desires and reasoning are themselves determined by prior causes, then the sense of autonomy remains illusory. The social and legal implications. The debate over free will is not just theoretical. It has profound implications for morality, justice, and social systems. The entire legal system is built on the assumption of personal responsibility. If someone commits a crime, they are presumed to have chosen to do so and are thus deserving of punishment. But if actions are determined by factors beyond conscious control, genetics, upbringing, neurological conditions, then the concept of blame becomes ethically fraught. Some argue that recognizing the illusory nature of free will could lead to a more compassionate and rehabilitative justice system, one that focuses on preventing harm rather than retributive punishment. Others worry that abandoning belief in free will might erode personal accountability, leading to fatalism or diminished motivation. Psychological studies have shown that when people are exposed to arguments against free will, they may become more prone to cheating or aggressive behavior, suggesting that the belief in autonomy serves an important social function. The psychological need for control. Even if free will is an illusion, the feeling of agency is a powerful and necessary psychological construct. Experiments have demonstrated that a sense of control is crucial for mental well-being. In studies where participants are deprived of control, such as being unable to influence outcomes in a game, they experience increased stress and helplessness. Conversely, the illusion of control, such as believing one can influence a lottery outcome, can enhance motivation and persistence. This suggests that, regardless of its metaphysical validity, the perception of free will is deeply embedded in human cognition. It shapes how we set goals, exert effort, and derive meaning from our actions. Without it, we might struggle to find purpose in our decisions, leading to existential paralysis. The paradox in everyday life. The tension between determinism and free will plays out in daily experience. On one hand, we recognize that our choices are influenced by countless factors: our biology, our environment, our unconscious biases. On the other hand, we cannot help but feel like we are making decisions in real time. When faced with a difficult choice, we deliberate as if the outcome is undetermined, even if, in reality, our deliberation is itself part of a predetermined process. This paradox is unresolvable in an absolute sense. We cannot prove that free will exists, yet we also cannot function without assuming it does. The very act of questioning free will relies on the belief that we can freely engage in such reasoning, a self-referential loop that highlights the inescapable nature of the dilemma. A middle path? Perhaps the most pragmatic approach is to accept that free will operates on two levels: the subjective experience of choice and the objective reality of causation. While our decisions may be determined by prior causes, the process of decision-making, weighing options, reflecting on consequences, still feels real and meaningful. Even if the outcome is inevitable from a deterministic standpoint, the act of engaging with our choices shapes who we become. Eternal recurrence, the infinite loop of existence. The idea that time is cyclical, that all events repeat themselves infinitely in an endless loop, is a concept that has haunted and fascinated thinkers for centuries. Known as eternal recurrence, this hypothesis suggests that every moment of your life, every joy and sorrow, every triumph and failure, will recur in exactly the same sequence, over and over, without variation, for eternity. There is no final escape, no ultimate resolution, only the perpetual return of the same. Unlike linear time, which moves toward an endpoint or progress, eternal recurrence presents existence as an infinite replay, a cosmic record stuck on repeat. At first glance, the notion seems abstract, even absurd. Yet, when examined deeply, it forces a radical confrontation with the nature of existence, meaning, and how one chooses to live. If everything we experience will happen again, unchanged, forever, what does that imply about our decisions, our regrets, our aspirations? The psychological weight of this idea is immense, transforming it from a mere thought experiment into a profound existential challenge. The origins and philosophical foundations. While the concept of cyclical time appears in various ancient traditions, its most famous philosophical articulation comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, who presented eternal recurrence not as a cosmological certainty, but as a test of one's attitude toward life. In The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduces the idea as a hypothetical. What if a demon whispered to you that this life, as you have lived it, would return to you infinitely, with no variation? Would you react with despair or with triumphant affirmation? Nietzsche's framing is crucial. It is not a doctrine to be proven, but a lens through which to evaluate one's existence. The question is not whether eternal recurrence is true in a scientific sense, but what it reveals about our capacity to embrace life in its entirety. If one could will the eternal return of every moment, even the suffering, then that life is one of absolute acceptance. If the idea fills one with dread, then there are aspects of existence still unaffirmed, still rejected. The scientific perspective. Is eternal recurrence possible? While Nietzsche's treatment was primarily existential, modern physics has occasionally brushed against similar ideas. In a closed infinite universe governed by entropy, some theoretical models suggest that given enough time, particle configurations could eventually repeat, leading to the same sequences of events recurring. The Poincare recurrence theorem, for instance, posits that in a finite system with fixed energy, given infinite time, every possible state will be revisited infinitely often. However, these models remain speculative and are far from confirming anything like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. The expansion of the universe, quantum indeterminacy, and the arrow of time all complicate the picture. Yet, the scientific flirtation with cyclicality underscores that the idea is not purely fantastical. It lingers at the edges of our understanding of reality. The psychological impact. Living as if everything will repeat. The true power of eternal recurrence lies not in its metaphysical plausibility, but in its psychological effect. Imagine truly believing that every action, every thought, every experience you have will replay endlessly. How would that change the way you live? For some, the idea is paralyzing. Every mistake would be magnified, every moment of suffering rendered inescapable. The weight of regret could become unbearable, knowing that not only did a particular failure happen, but it will happen again forever. The fear of being trapped in an unchangeable loop might lead to existential despair, a sense that nothing ultimately matters because nothing new can ever emerge. But for others, the concept could be liberating. If every moment is eternally significant, then there is no wasted experience. Every joy is infinitely preserved. Every act of love is eternally reaffirmed. The present moment, no matter how mundane, gains an almost sacred weight because it is not just happening now, but forever. This perspective could inspire a more deliberate, passionate way of living, where one strives to make each choice something they would willingly relive. The challenge of a more fatty, loving one's fate. Nietzsche tied eternal recurrence to the idea of a more fatty, the love of fate. To affirm eternal recurrence is to say yes not just to the highlights of life, but to all of it, the pain, the boredom, the unresolved struggles. It is the ultimate act of acceptance, refusing to resent or wish away any part of existence. This is not passive resignation, but an active embrace. If one could look back on their life and, knowing it would repeat exactly as it was, still feel no desire to alter a single moment, that, for Nietzsche, was the mark of a life fully lived. Few can claim such unconditional affirmation, which is why eternal recurrence serves as a measure of one's relationship to their own existence. The illusion of linear progress and the trap of waiting. Modern culture is deeply invested in the idea of progress, that time moves forward toward improvement, that the future will redeem the present. We tell ourselves this hardship is temporary, things will get better. But eternal recurrence shatters this narrative. If time is a loop, there is no better future to wait for, only the perpetual return of now. This forces a confrontation with the present. If we cannot defer meaning to some later point, we must find it here, in this moment, exactly as it is. No more I'll be happy when, because that when will simply lead back to another now. The illusion of progress is stripped away, leaving only the raw immediacy of existence. The ethical dimension, infinite responsibility. If every action recurs eternally, then every choice carries infinite weight. A single act of cruelty is not just one event. It is an event that will happen again and again, forever. Conversely, every act of kindness is likewise eternally reaffirmed. This perspective could serve as a radical ethical motivator. If you would not want a moment to repeat infinitely, then perhaps it should not be done at all. Some might argue this is an impossible standard. Human life is too messy for every decision to bear such cosmic significance. But that is precisely the challenge. Eternal recurrence does not ask for perfection. It asks for full awareness of the weight of our existence. The artistic and literary exploration. Artists and writers have long grappled with the haunting beauty of eternal recurrence. Jorge Luis Borges' short story The Circular Ruins explores a dreamer who realizes he himself is a dream, suggesting an infinite regress of existence. Films like Groundhog Day and Russian Doll play with the psychological toll and eventual transformation that comes from reliving the same events repeatedly. These narratives often arrive at a similar conclusion. The only escape from the loop is not through external change, but through internal transformation. The protagonist must shift their perspective, their values, their way of being. Only then does the cycle either break or become meaningful. This mirrors Nietzsche's insistence that the point is not to change what happens, but to change how we relate to it. The Fermi paradox. Where is everybody? The universe is unimaginably vast. With hundreds of billions of galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, and an increasing number of known exoplanets, inhabitable zones, the sheer scale suggests that life should be abundant. Statistically, intelligent civilizations ought to have emerged countless times across cosmic history. And yet, we see no evidence of them. No alien signals, no spacecraft, no megastructures, just silence. This contradiction between the high probability of extraterrestrial life and the complete absence of any observable trace of it is known as the Fermi paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who famously asked, "Where is everybody?" This question has haunted scientists, philosophers, and futurists for decades. If life is likely, why does the universe appear so empty? The answers proposed range from the sobering to the terrifying, each revealing something profound about our place in the cosmos and the possible fates of intelligence itself. The foundations of the paradox. The Fermi paradox arises from a few key assumptions. First, the principle of mediocrity, the idea that Earth is not special, and that the conditions that led to life here should exist elsewhere. Given the number of Earth-like planets in habitable zones, life should have emerged many times over. Second, the age of the universe. At 13.8 billion years old, there has been ample time for civilizations to arise, spread, and make their presence known. Even if only a tiny fraction of stars hosted intelligent life, some should have developed interstellar travel or communication by now. Yet, despite decades of searching, through radio telescopes, optical surveys, and even artifact hunting on Earth and the Moon, we have found nothing. No definitive signals, no alien probes, no signs of astroengineering. The Great Silence, as it's sometimes called, stands in stark contrast to our expectations. Possible resolutions, filters, catastrophes, and isolation. Numerous hypotheses attempt to explain the Fermi paradox, each with its own implications for humanity's future. Broadly, they fall into three categories. 1. We are early. One optimistic possibility is that we are among the first intelligent civilizations to emerge. Complex life may require an extraordinarily rare set of conditions, not just a habitable planet, but stable environments over billions of years, the right chemical precursors, and the absence of sterilizing cosmic disasters. If intelligence is a recent development in cosmic terms, we might simply be ahead of the curve. This would mean that, in the future, the galaxy could teem with life. But for now, we are alone in our corner of the universe. 2. Civilizations self-destruct. A darker explanation is that intelligent life tends to annihilate itself before achieving interstellar expansion. Nuclear war, environmental collapse, runaway artificial intelligence, or other technological catastrophes could act as a great filter, an evolutionary bottleneck that prevents civilizations from surviving long enough to colonize the stars. If this is the case, the silence of the cosmos is a warning. Humanity may be approaching its own filter, and our survival is far from guaranteed. 3. Advanced civilizations are undetectable or uninterested. Another possibility is that advanced civilizations exist, but are either impossible for us to detect or have no interest in making contact. They might communicate in ways we don't yet understand, using neutrino beams, quantum entanglement, or other technologies beyond our comprehension. Alternatively, they may deliberately avoid us, either to prevent cultural contamination, a zoo hypothesis, or because we are simply irrelevant to their pursuits. A more unsettling variation is the dark forest theory, which posits that civilizations remain silent out of fear. In a universe where hostile advanced entities might exist, broadcasting one's presence could be suicidal. The implications for humanity. The Fermi paradox is not just an academic puzzle. It forces us to confront fundamental questions about intelligence, survival, and our future. If we are alone, it places an immense responsibility on humanity to preserve and propagate life. We may be the universe's only chance to know itself. If we are not alone, but civilizations are rare or doomed, then our survival becomes even more urgent. We must navigate the great filter. And if advanced civilizations are simply hidden, the question becomes, what are they doing that we cannot see? The search continues. Despite the paradox, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, persists, now aided by machine learning, more powerful telescopes, and even efforts to detect alien artifacts in our solar system. Breakthrough Listen, the James Webb Space Telescope, and future missions to Europa and Enceladus, moons with subsurface oceans, may yet provide answers. But until we find definitive evidence, the Fermi paradox remains one of science's greatest mysteries, a haunting reminder of how little we know and how much is still at stake. Nihilism, is nothing really matters? The idea that life has no inherent meaning is one of the most unsettling and liberating philosophical propositions in human thought. Nihilism, derived from the Latin nihil, nothing, is the rejection of all traditional beliefs, values, and meanings, not out of cynicism, but from the conviction that objective purpose does not exist. There is no grand design, no cosmic justice, no ultimate reason for suffering or joy. Existence simply is, and any meaning we find is a human invention, not a universal truth. This perspective has been both condemned as a philosophy of despair and embraced as a necessary step toward intellectual and existential honesty. If nothing matters by default, then what? Does this realization lead to paralysis, or does it open the door to a more authentic way of living? The origins of nihilism. While skepticism toward meaning has existed since ancient times, nihilism as a defined philosophical stance emerged most prominently in the 19th century. Friedrich Nietzsche, often mischaracterized as a nihilist himself, diagnosed nihilism as the inevitable consequence of modernity's erosion of religious and moral certainties. As science displaced myth and reason undermined dogma, people were left with a universe that no longer provided ready-made answers to life's biggest questions. For Nietzsche, passive nihilism, the collapse of meaning without an alternative, was a danger. But he also saw the potential for active nihilism, the destruction of old values to make way for new, self-created ones. The real challenge was not whether life had intrinsic meaning, but whether individuals could endure that truth and still affirm existence. The absurd and the void. Nihilism intersects with existentialism and absurdism, particularly in the works of Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, argued that the human craving for meaning clashes with a silent, indifferent universe, a contradiction he called the absurd. The fundamental question of philosophy, he claimed, was whether suicide was the only logical response to this realization. Yet Camus rejected nihilism's total negation. Instead, he proposed rebellion, continuing to live, create, and seek joy despite the absurdity. Sisyphus, condemned to eternally roll a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down, becomes a symbol of defiant perseverance. His struggle is meaningless, but his awareness of it transforms him into an absurd hero. Nihilism in science and naturalism. Modern scientific materialism often leads to nihilistic conclusions by default. If the universe is a vast, purposeless mechanism governed by physical laws, and consciousness is merely an emergent property of neural activity, then concepts like meaning and value are fundamentally human constructs. Evolutionary biology explains morality as adaptive behavior, not divine command. Physics reduces reality to particles and forces without intention. This scientific worldview does not require nihilism. Many scientists find profound awe in the cosmos, but it does remove the scaffolding of preordained purpose. The challenge then becomes, in a universe indifferent to human concerns, how do we justify our ethics, ambitions, and emotions? The psychological impact of nihilism. Confronting the possibility that nothing matters can trigger existential dread, a paralyzing awareness of life's apparent futility. Studies in psychology have shown that when people feel their actions lack significance, they experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, and disengagement. The fear is that nihilism leads to apathy or even self-destruction. Yet for others, the absence of inherent meaning is freeing. If no external authority dictates purpose, then individuals are at liberty to define it for themselves. This is the core of existentialist ethics. Meaning is not discovered, but created. The responsibility is immense, but so is the potential for authenticity. Nihilism in culture and art. Nihilistic themes permeate literature, film, and music, reflecting society's anxieties about meaninglessness. From Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, which explores the torment of a man paralyzed by hyperawareness, to modern films like Fight Club, which satirizes consumerist attempts to fill the void, art often grapples with the tension between despair and liberation. Even comedy leans into nihilism. Think of absurdist humor that highlights the randomness of existence, or the rise of dark memes that cope with existential dread through irony. These cultural expressions suggest that nihilism is not just a philosophical position, but a lived experience, oscillating between horror and humor. Ethics without foundations. One of the most pressing critiques of nihilism is that it undermines morality. If nothing matters, why care about justice, compassion, or truth? The answer varies. Some nihilists adopt moral relativism, arguing that ethics are useful fictions. Others embrace existentialist or humanist approaches, asserting that while morality has no cosmic basis, human suffering and flourishing are still real enough to demand action. The practical consequence is that nihilism does not necessarily lead to amorality. It simply shifts the burden of justification. Instead of appealing to divine law or natural order, ethical systems must root themselves in human needs, empathy, or pragmatic social contracts.